Hello, my name is Corey Gray, and today we're going to be talking about Amy Beach and her Gaelic Symphony. So, Amy Beach was born in 1867, she died in 1944, but she was an American composer, and she's well known for her work, the Gaelic Symphony, which was the first symphonic work to be composed by a woman that was performed by a professional symphony orchestra. In this case, it was the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Amy Beach, she had crazy musical talent from a very, like, literally from the age of 1, she could sing over 40 tunes, and by the age of 4, she had her first composition memorized, and she actually played that at one of her first recitals along with, a couple other Bach, Beethoven pieces. And so she was just, when we think of great musicians like Mozart and Beethoven, especially Mozart, we know, he had crazy talent as a 5-year-old. He was playing stuff and improvising at the piano. She reminds me quite a bit of Mozart's skills. Um, she also had this really weird ability to hear, she would hear music and then visually see or feel a color. So when she was a kid, there was a story of her asking her mother to be, to play on the piano the pink music or the purple music. And her mom always thought that she was referring to the books, like the cover of the books that the music was in. But it turns out, after as time went on and Amy Beach, worked on her talents and kind of learned what her skills were. She found that she actually, when she would hear music, certain keys, she would see a color visually. So she has C major as white, E flat major as pink, and G major as red, just to name a few. That is an extraordinary skill, and I really wish, as a musician, I wish I had something like that. It would be really, it's hard to even fathom what that would be like. And so, when we think of her in the sphere of great composers, it really boosts her up there, gives her legitimacy. Yeah. So her compositional journey, um, she was a great pianist. By the age of 16, she was publicly performing her concertos and other large etudes. Basically, from the age of 16, people would pay to watch her perform. And when she turned 18, she actually married a man who is 20 years older than her. We don't have time to go into that, but 20 years older than her. And he actually asked her to step out of, kind of step out of the limelight and focus, on being a mother and all that stuff. But instead, she did stop performing publicly, but she started solely composing and working on, tailoring her own personal compositional style. And so she, because she was a woman, she didn't have any formal training with composition. She would write down all of her thoughts in these little notebooks that she had, and she would go to a ton of concerts. Basically any concerts that were around. She lived on the East Coast, so there were plenty of them. She would go and she would write down, her likes, her dislikes, the colors she saw, things she felt, and she'd go home and push those ideas into her own compositions. And so we can really see, once we get talking more about the Gaelic Symphony itself, we can see a ton of different influences from around the world. It's really quite interesting. So, a couple of songs before we get into the Gaelic Symphony is the Mass in E flat. So her first large-scale choral work, so that's for vocal performers, to be written by a woman. And it was performed by the Handel and Haydn Society, which is actually still around today. Which, this is back in 1892. And so that's a group of vocal performers who are still singing, in the mid 2020s. So that's really quite a feat. And the second one I did want to bring up was a piece called The Festival Jubilate, which is another choral work. This one was written for the Chicago World Fair in 1893, and she wrote it specifically for the creation of the Women's Building in Chicago. And so this piece would just be like playing constantly when people were walking around the fair, viewing new technologies and all that stuff. It was also written for over 400 voices, which is insane to me. I can't imagine that. So yeah, just like big works, moving forward towards the Gaelic Symphony, her name recognition is growing and growing, and people are giving legitimacy to her works. So why did she write the Gaelic Symphony? The Gaelic Symphony, when we think of it, the main vocab word that comes up is this idea of nationalist music. And, to speak in simple terms, the idea of national music is kind of the nation's musical identity. So when we think of, places like Russian, we think of composers like Rachmaninoff or Scriabin and their works, depending on the time frame, are, militaristic with very brass heavy melodies and motifs. And so, looking back towards America and the United States, we were around the time when the Gaelic Symphony was composed in 1894. We were just, 110, 115 years old. And we really hadn't had time to come up with our nation's musical identity. That just wasn't something that we were focused on. So, here in America, composers were kind of riffing on European and Asian composers and just kind of doing, what they're doing across the sea, across the ocean. So we really weren't doing anything of our own true passion. So Amy Beach started off listening to a composer named Antonin Dvořák, who is a Czech composer, and he was actually brought over to the Americas to help find the United States musical identity. And he did that by, he went around, he listened to Native American melodies, African American melodies, and these are folk melodies, and that will be a key here in a bit. But taking influences from Dvořák's hometown in Czechoslovakia, he would take his own folk melodies and combine them with African American spiritual melodies, Native American melodies, and this created the New World Symphony, which he wrote in 1892. And Beach actually was there at the premiere for that, and this is like a whole new realm of music. It was symphonic music, but it was for folk music, which was something that no one had even thought to put, folk music. Folk music is basically music that, is, you would hear it growing up, but you wouldn't hear it performed. It's just not that type of thing. So hearing, melodies that people heard growing up on the big stage in the symphonic setting was amazing. It blew people's mind. So Beach drew inspiration from that. She looked to her Celtic roots. She drew a lot of most of the things we'll talk about are Irish dance tunes, Gaelic dance tunes, and so she drew from her past, brought them over, and to kind of symbolize America's melting potness at the time. We had people from all over the world. We still do. America's, people say it's one big melting pot. This is kind of what she was exemplifying in her work. So moving on to a quick analysis of the Gaelic Symphony. There are 4 movements. It's around 45 minutes, depending on who you watch. Sometimes it's longer or shorter. But the first movement is the Allegro con fuoco movement, and it's in sonata form. And it's featuring her previous melody from one of her solo vocal works called Darkest of the Night. And that's kind of like the main melody that we see throughout all of the themes. It comes back a couple of times in all of the movements. And that's kind of like our main theme of the Gaelic Symphony. But you also see from, the idea of American nationalist music, this folk melody called Conor O'Reilly of Clonish brought in throughout. And this is seen within the development of the piece, and just to kind of give it a different vibe throughout the middle of the piece. Yeah. So moving on to the second movement, the Alla Siciliana Allegro Vivace section. It's in reverse scherzo trio section, which just kind of showcases Beach's sorry, totally blanking on the word right now. Just kind of showcases Beach's ingenuity. I said a reverse scherzo trio. Scherzo is basically like a fast section with 3 main parts for a trio. What she did, instead of having a fast, slow, fast section, she did a slow, fast, slow section. in the second movement. So just little things like that, switching the order of, well-defined vocabulistic terms like the scherzo, really brought out her compositional style. Within the second movement, the melody we hear is called The Little Field of Barley, which is actually a Gaelic love song. And that was the primary theme for the entire movement. The third movement, Lento con molto expression, this is the slow movement. It's the longest movement in the piece, which makes sense since it's the slow movement. It's about 12 minutes long. And it's essentially two interwoven sonatas. So a sonata has three parts. You'll just look at it like that. It's kind of like that. So the first part for both of them, the second part, and the third part down there. And there are two main themes, two sonatas, two main themes. The first one is called The Lively Child, and the second one is called Which Way Did She Go? So these are both folk melodies that she wove into each other. It's a beautiful, beautiful movement. And finally, the fourth movement is Allegro di molto. This is the grand finale. It starts, it sounds very reminiscent of the very first couple measures of the first movement. And so it kind of brings us back to the beginning. And it's the only movement in the entire piece that uses Beach's own themes, own melodies. And it's focused on that melody of Darkest the Night. And so it's basically just a recap of everything we've heard. And the grand finale, it closes out with a big finish, and it's a really, really amazing movement too. So that's my talk on Amy Beach and the Gaelic Symphony. She's, an absolute boss when it comes to composition. And, she established, her name as a leading composer in American history. And she also opened the gate for future female composers in this realm. And she's one of my favorite composers. This is one of my favorite pieces of music. So thank you so much for letting me talk on this, and I appreciate your time. Have a great weekend.